The church doors burst open with a sound like thunder, and every head turned at once. Elena Marsh stood at the altar in her white gown, her hands trembling around a bouquet of pale roses, waiting for a groom who was not walking toward her. Instead, Daniel Price stood frozen at the back of the church, his tuxedo jacket half undone, his face pale with something that looked less like fear and more like guilt. Beside him, holding his hand, stood Claire, Elena's own sister. For 3 full seconds, nobody in the church made a sound. The organist's fingers slipped from the keys. The priest closed his prayer book slowly, as if closing it might undo what everyone had just seen. 200 guests sat frozen in their seats, phones lowering from where they had been recording, eyes darting between the bride at the altar and the couple standing where the aisle began. Daniel finally spoke, his voice cracking through the silence like a dropped glass. He said he was sorry. He said he could not marry Elena. He said that somewhere between the engagement party and this morning, he had fallen in love with Claire, and he could not stand in front of God and lie about loving someone else. Elena did not move. She stood very still, the way people stand when their body has not yet told their mind what has happened. The roses in her hands began to shake, small white petals falling one by one onto the marble floor, drifting down like snow that had forgotten what season it was. Her mother, Margaret, rose halfway out of her seat, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her father, Henry, said nothing at all, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the son he had once called his future son-in-law, with something close to hatred now blooming behind them. Claire, for her part, did not look ashamed. She looked almost relieved, as though she had been carrying a secret so heavy that finally setting it down in front of 200 witnesses felt like breathing again. She squeezed Daniel's hand and lifted her chin, daring anyone in the room to say a word against her. It was Elena's best friend, Grace, who moved first. She rushed up the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, and reached Elena just as the bride's knees seemed to buckle. Grace caught her by the shoulders, steadying her, whispering her name over and over, as if saying it enough times might bring her back into her own body. Elena finally spoke, her voice so quiet that only Grace could hear it. She asked how long. Not why, not how could you, just how long. Daniel did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was written across Claire's face, in the way she would not meet her sister's eyes, in the guilt she wore like a coat 2 sizes too small. The priest cleared his throat and asked, gently, whether anyone wished to say anything further, though it was clear there was nothing left worth saying inside those walls. Guests began to whisper among themselves, some already reaching for their phones again, and Elena understood in that moment that by evening, this would not just be her heartbreak. It would be a story, a headline, a piece of gossip passed from hand to hand at every dinner table in the city, because Daniel Price was not just any man. His family owned half the shipping routes along the eastern coast, and Elena's family had spent 2 years building an alliance through this marriage that both families had needed for reasons far beyond love. Grace helped Elena down from the altar, gathering the long train of her gown so it would not catch beneath her feet. Elena walked past her mother without looking at her, past her father whose hand reached out but did not quite touch her, past rows of familiar faces that suddenly felt like strangers. She walked past Daniel, who tried to say her name, and past Claire, who said nothing at all, because there was nothing Claire could say that would not make things worse. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt too bright, too ordinary, as if the world had not noticed that Elena's entire life had just been rearranged in the space of a few sentences. She stood on the church steps in her wedding gown, the veil slipping from her carefully pinned hair, and for the first time since Daniel's voice had broken the silence, she allowed herself to cry. Grace stood beside her, an arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, murmuring that they would get through this, that Daniel was a coward and Claire was worse, that Elena deserved so much better than either of them. Elena barely heard the words. She was staring instead at the small crowd already gathering at the bottom of the steps, drawn by the sound of raised voices from inside the church, phones already lifted to capture the bride who had just been left at her own wedding. It was then that Elena heard the sound of engines. Not one car, but several, moving in careful formation, the kind of sound that belonged to motorcades in films rather than to ordinary streets. She turned, still gripping Grace's arm, and watched as 3 sleek black vehicles rounded the corner and came to a smooth stop directly in front of the church steps. The crowd's murmuring shifted instantly. Whatever gossip had been spreading about the bride left at the altar suddenly took second place to the mystery of who was arriving in vehicles that clearly did not belong to anyone from this small, ordinary town. The rear door of the middle car opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat that fit him as though it had been made for no one else. He moved with an unhurried confidence, the kind that came from never having needed to rush for anyone. Two other men stepped out behind him, flanking him at a respectful distance, clearly guards rather than guests, though nobody watching could have said guards for what, or for whom. Elena felt Grace's grip tighten on her arm. The crowd on the steps had gone quiet, parting slightly as the man approached, though no one had asked them to move. He climbed the steps without hesitation, his gaze fixed on Elena the entire time, as though the wedding chaos unfolding behind her, the whispers, the phones, the abandoned bouquet still lying somewhere on the church floor, none of it existed for him at all. He stopped 2 steps below her, which put them almost at eye level, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable, neither pity nor curiosity, but something steadier than both. He introduced himself as Alaric. He did not offer a last name, and something about the way he said the single word made it clear that a last name was unnecessary, that anyone who needed to know more already did, and anyone who did not would learn soon enough. Elena, still raw, still trembling, asked him plainly what he wanted. She had no patience left for strangers, no matter how striking or composed. Her wedding day had already ended in ruin. She did not have room in her chest for another surprise. Alaric's answer came quietly, but it carried through the stunned silence on the steps as clearly as if he had shouted it. He said he had come for his bride. For a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. Grace's hand slipped from her arm in shock. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera clicked, capturing a moment none of them yet understood. Elena asked him, her voice sharper now, whether he had confused her with someone else, whether perhaps he meant to be down the street, or in another church entirely, because she was quite certain she had never met him in her life. Alaric's expression softened only slightly, the closest thing to sympathy he seemed willing to show a stranger. He said he understood this was not the moment she had expected, and that he had not meant to add to whatever chaos had already unfolded inside those doors. But he told her, with a calm certainty that unsettled her more than any shouting could have, that there was an old agreement between their families, one signed long before she had been old enough to understand what it meant, and that the terms of that agreement had just shifted because of what had happened inside the church only minutes ago. Elena stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to admit this was some strange, cruel joke arranged by Daniel or Claire to humiliate her further, but nothing in his face suggested humor. Nothing in the stillness of the men behind him suggested performance. Margaret appeared at the church doors just then, having pushed her way through the crowd of guests, still murmuring inside, and the moment her eyes landed on Alaric, all color drained from her face. She said his name under her breath, not as a question, but as a confirmation, the kind of recognition that came from memory rather than surprise. Elena turned toward her mother, searching her face for some explanation, and found instead the look of a woman caught between 2 decades of silence and a truth she could no longer keep buried. Grace, ever protective, stepped slightly in front of Elena, asking Alaric directly who exactly he thought he was, to arrive uninvited at a wedding, announcing claims on a woman he had never met. Alaric did not seem offended by the challenge. If anything, something in his eyes suggested he respected it. He said simply that he understood how strange this appeared, and that he had not come to make demands in the middle of grief. He said only that Elena deserved the truth, and that the truth belonged to her family to explain, not to him, standing as a stranger on the steps of a church that had just witnessed her heart break in front of 200 people. He turned to Margaret then, his gaze steady, and said that perhaps it was time the Marsh family finally told her daughter what her grandfather had promised, all those years ago, to a kingdom most people in this city did not even know existed beyond old rumors and half-forgotten stories. Margaret's silence answered the question before she ever opened her mouth. Elena stood on the steps in her ruined wedding gown, staring between her mother's stricken face and the composed stranger who claimed to have come for her. And for the first time since Daniel's confession inside the church, her heartbreak was joined by something else entirely. Confusion. And beneath it, quiet and unwelcome, The first flicker of curiosity about a truth her family had clearly spent years trying to keep buried. The crowd around them had grown larger now, phones still raised, whispers spreading faster than anyone could stop them. But Elena, for the first time all day, was no longer thinking about Daniel, or Claire, or the wedding that had just collapsed behind her. She was thinking about the word Alaric had used, bride, and wondering, with a mixture of dread and disbelief, what exactly her family had promised away, long before she had ever been given a choice. The crowd on the church steps had grown thick with whispers, and Elena felt every one of them pressing against her skin, like small, cold hands. She looked at her mother, waiting for an explanation, but Margaret only pressed her lips together and glanced nervously at Alaric, as though hoping he might be the one to carry the burden of speaking first. Henry finally pushed through the crowd, his face a mixture of confusion and quiet dread. He took one look at the man standing calmly on the steps and went very still, the same way Margaret had. Whatever this stranger represented, it was clear both of Elena's parents recognized it immediately, even if Elena herself did not. Grace, still standing protectively beside her friend, asked the question Elena could not seem to form. She asked what exactly this agreement was supposed to mean, and why nobody in Elena's family had ever mentioned it before today.
It was Henry who finally answered, his voice low and tired, as though he had been dreading this conversation for years and was almost relieved it had finally arrived, even under these circumstances.
He said that Elena's grandfather, a man neither Elena nor Claire had ever truly known, had made a promise decades earlier to a family from a distant, private community that few outside it ever spoke of publicly. The promise had been simple in words but heavy in consequence. One daughter from the Marsh family line would marry into that family when the time came, sealing an old debt of loyalty between the two households. Elena stared at her father, waiting for the rest of the explanation, the part that would make this make sense, but none came. Instead, Henry glanced toward Alaric, silently asking whether he should be the one to continue, or whether that responsibility now belonged to him. Alaric spoke instead, his voice calm, without any trace of triumph or cruelty in it, only a steady kind of patience that Elena found strangely disarming given everything else happening around her. He explained that the arrangement had always been intended for whichever daughter carried the family name into marriage first. For most of Elena's life, it had quietly been assumed that arrangement would fall to Claire, since Claire was the one who had, until this very afternoon, been engaged to marry first. The weight of his words settled over Elena slowly, like snow gathering on a rooftop until it finally gave way. Claire's wedding to Daniel had been the one meant to fulfill the old promise, but Claire had broken her engagement to marry someone else entirely, months ago, in private, a fact Elena had never learned until this very moment, standing in her ruined gown. And in breaking that path, the responsibility of the old promise had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, onto Elena, the only remaining daughter free to marry. Elena's breath caught somewhere in her throat. She looked toward Claire, only to realize her sister had not followed them out of the church at all. Perhaps Claire already knew this story far better than she had ever let on. Perhaps some of today's chaos had been less about love and more about escape. Margaret finally spoke, her voice trembling with something that sounded almost like shame. She said they had always hoped it would never come to this, that perhaps the old families had forgotten the promise entirely, that decades of silence meant it no longer applied. She said they had never wanted to burden either of their daughters with an obligation neither girl had ever agreed to. Elena felt anger rising beneath her grief now, sharp and sudden. She asked her parents how they could have kept something like this secret her entire life, how they could have let her build a future with Daniel, while quietly knowing that future might collapse the moment fate shifted its hand. Henry had no good answer. He only repeated, quietly, that they had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it would never matter. Alaric, watching the exchange with the same unreadable calm he had carried since stepping out of his car, finally addressed Elena directly. He said he understood this was an impossible amount to accept in a single afternoon, especially one that had already broken her heart once. He said he had not come to force anything upon her, only to make certain the truth was finally spoken aloud, since silence had clearly done nothing but cause harm for years. Elena studied him carefully then, searching his composed features for some sign of deception, some hint that this entire scene had been staged for reasons she could not yet imagine. But there was nothing performative in the way he stood, nothing rehearsed in the quiet patience with which he waited for her to process everything at her own pace. She asked him plainly what would happen if she refused, if she simply turned around, walked back into her ordinary life, and pretended none of this had ever reached her doorstep. Alaric considered the question seriously before answering. He said that unlike some agreements built on threat or punishment, this one had never demanded force. If Elena refused, there would be no consequence delivered upon her directly. But he added, more quietly, that the debt her grandfather had promised still remained, and that other, older obligations tied to it might eventually touch her family, in ways far beyond her control, in business dealings, in old alliances that had protected the Marsh name for years, without her ever realizing it. It was not a threat. It was simply information, offered plainly, and somehow that honesty struck Elena harder than any manipulation could have. Grace, still fiercely protective, asked Alaric why any of this mattered right now, in this exact moment, when Elena had just watched her fiancé leave her at the altar for her own sister. Could this conversation not have waited for a day when Elena was not standing in a ruined wedding gown in front of half the town? Alaric's gaze shifted toward Grace, and for the first time, something like genuine regret passed over his features. He admitted that the timing was far from ideal, and that under different circumstances, he would have preferred to approach the family privately, away from crowds and cameras. But word had already reached him that morning that the Marsh wedding was underway, and given how directly it related to a promise his own family had waited decades to see honored, he had felt it necessary to act before misinformation or manipulation could spread further. Elena wondered, briefly, what he meant by manipulation, but the thought slipped away beneath the heavier weight of everything else pressing down on her. She turned back toward her parents, studying them both as though seeing them for the first time. She asked, quietly, whether they expected her to agree to this, whether after everything that had already been taken from her today, they intended to ask her to give up her freedom as well. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. She said this was not a decision anyone could make for Elena. It never had been. The choice, painful as it might be, belonged entirely to her. Alaric added, gently, that he had no interest in dragging a reluctant bride into any arrangement. If Elena chose to walk away entirely, he would honor that choice, difficult as its consequences might be for the old alliance. But he said, plainly, that he believed she deserved time to think, away from the noise of this crowd and the sting of this particular afternoon, before making any decision that would shape the rest of her life. Elena looked past him, toward the church doors, where guests were slowly beginning to filter out, some already whispering behind raised hands, others recording quietly on their phones, as though this entire scene were simply the next act of the same dramatic afternoon. She felt suddenly, unbearably tired, the kind of exhaustion that came not from her body, but from carrying too many revelations in too short a span of time. Grace, sensing her friend's exhaustion, stepped forward and asked Alaric plainly whether Elena could have time before answering anything at all. Alaric agreed immediately, without hesitation, and said he would not press her for a decision today, or even this week. He asked only that she consider everything carefully, and that if she wished to speak with him, or to learn more about the history behind the promise her grandfather had made, she would find a way to reach him. He reached into his coat and produced a small card, offering it not to Elena's parents but directly to Elena herself, as if to make clear that whatever decision came next belonged to her alone, not to the family who had kept this secret from her for so long. Elena took the card without looking at it, her fingers numb from the cold and from everything else. Alaric studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he stepped back, giving her the space she so clearly needed. He turned to leave, his guards falling into step behind him, but paused after only a few steps and looked back at her one final time. He said, quietly, that he was sorry her wedding day had ended this way, and that whatever she decided about the promise between their families, she deserved far better than what had happened to her inside that church. Then he walked down the steps, climbed into his waiting car, and was gone as smoothly as he had arrived, leaving Elena standing in her ruined gown, surrounded by a crowd of stunned faces, holding a small card that suddenly felt heavier than anything else she had carried that day. Grace wrapped an arm around her shoulders once more, guiding her gently down the steps and away from the lingering onlookers. Margaret and Henry followed a few paces behind, neither one quite able to meet their daughter's eyes. Elena did not look back at the church. She did not look for Daniel, or for Claire, or for any explanation that might still be waiting somewhere behind those heavy doors. She simply walked forward, one careful step at a time, the small white card pressed tightly in her palm, the weight of an old promise settling over her like a second veil she had never asked to wear. The days after the wedding blurred together in a way Elena had never experienced before. She stayed at Grace's apartment rather than returning to her own, unwilling to face the wedding dress still hanging in her closet, or the empty side of the bed that had, until 3 days ago, been waiting for a future she thought she understood. Grace made tea, Elena did not drink, and cooked meals, Elena barely touched, hovering nearby with the quiet patience of someone who understood that grief needed company more than conversation. The small white card Alaric had given her sat untouched on the nightstand for 2 full days, though Elena found her eyes drifting toward it more often than she wanted to admit. News of what had happened at the church spread exactly as Elena feared it would. By the second day, clips of Daniel's confession, and Claire standing beside him, had already circulated online, cut into short videos with captions, dramatizing every possible detail. Elena avoided her phone entirely after Grace warned her what she would find there, though she could not avoid the pitying glances from neighbors, or the awkward silence that fell over the coffee shop near her apartment whenever she walked in. Her mother called several times, each message more apologetic than the last, though Elena found she still could not bring herself to answer. It was not anger alone keeping her silent, though anger certainly played its part. It was the disorienting realization that her entire childhood had been shaped, in some hidden way, by a promise she had never known existed, one that had been quietly waiting to reroute her life the moment circumstances allowed. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, Elena finally reached for the card. It was simple, elegant, containing only a name and a number, nothing more. No crest, no title, nothing to suggest the man behind it commanded the kind of presence she had witnessed on the church steps. She turned it over in her fingers for a long while, before finally setting it back down, telling herself she was not ready, though some small part of her recognized that admission for the lie it was. Grace found her sitting on the small balcony the next morning, wrapped in a blanket, watching the city slowly wake beneath a pale gray sky. She sat down beside her without a word at first, simply offering quiet company the way she had every day since the wedding. Eventually, she asked gently whether Elena had thought more about Alaric, about the strange, formal proposal buried inside everything he had said. Elena admitted honestly that she had thought of little else, not because she wanted to marry a stranger, but because for the first time in days, something other than heartbreak occupied her mind. Curiosity, however unwelcome, had begun creeping in around the edges of her grief. Grace asked, carefully, whether Elena believed the story her parents had told, the old promise, the debt between families, the kingdom that apparently existed somewhere beyond the world Elena had grown up in. Elena admitted she did not know what to believe. Her parents were not liars by nature, and the fear she had seen in her mother's eyes at the sight of Alaric had not looked like performance. But the entire situation still felt like something pulled from an old story rather than real life. It was Grace who suggested, gently, that perhaps understanding the truth might help Elena reclaim some control over a situation that had, so far, only ever been decided by other people. Daniel had chosen to leave her. Claire had chosen silence for months. Her parents had chosen secrecy for years. If Elena wanted any say in what happened next, perhaps the first step was simply asking the questions no one else had been willing to ask for her. That evening, after much hesitation, Elena finally called the number on the card. The call connected almost immediately, as though someone had been waiting for it. A calm, familiar voice answered, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel significant. Elena finally said his name, and Alaric answered simply that he was glad she had called, without any trace of surprise or triumph in his voice, only quiet relief. He asked how she was doing, a simple question that somehow felt more genuine coming from him than it had from anyone else who had asked it over the past few days. She answered honestly, admitting she did not entirely know. She told him she had questions, more than she could count, and that she needed real answers if she was ever going to make sense of everything that had happened since he stepped out of that car. Alaric agreed without hesitation. He offered to meet her somewhere private, somewhere away from cameras and curious neighbors, wherever she felt safest. Elena suggested a quiet cafe near the edge of the city, one she doubted anyone from her usual circles would recognize her in, especially not after days spent avoiding public spaces entirely. They agreed to meet the following afternoon. Grace insisted on coming along, not to intrude, but to wait nearby, in case Elena needed her. Elena did not argue. After everything her family had kept from her, she found she trusted very few people completely anymore, and Grace's steady presence had become one of the only constants she could rely on. The cafe was small, tucked along a quiet side street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Elena arrived early, choosing a table near the back, away from the window, and waited with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. Alaric arrived exactly on time, dressed far more casually than he had been at the church, though something about his presence still carried the same quiet authority. He sat across from her, his expression open, patient, without any of the formality she had expected. For a while, neither of them spoke. Elena studied him carefully, searching for cracks in the composed exterior he presented so effortlessly, but found none. Finally, she asked the question that had been circling her mind since the moment he introduced himself on the church steps. She asked him plainly who he really was, and what kind of family required an old promise like the one her grandfather had made decades earlier. Alaric answered without hesitation, though his voice remained low, careful, as though the truth itself demanded respect rather than spectacle. He told her that his family led a private community, one that had existed quietly outside public recognition for generations, built on old traditions of loyalty and protection, rather than public titles or ordinary politics. He explained that the position he held within that community was one of leadership, inherited through bloodline, though he was careful to avoid the exact language of kingship, perhaps sensing how strange it would sound to someone hearing it for the first time. Elena pressed further, asking why her grandfather, an ordinary businessman as far as she had always known, would have entered into any kind of agreement with a community so far removed from her family's usual world. Alaric explained that decades earlier, during a time of significant danger for his family's community, Elena's grandfather had provided critical support, financial and otherwise, at great personal risk. In gratitude, and to secure a lasting bond between the families, a promise had been made. One daughter, when the time came, would join the two families through marriage, cementing an alliance neither side ever wished to see broken. Elena absorbed this slowly, turning the story over in her mind, searching for the parts that still did not make sense. She asked why, if this promise had always existed, no one had approached her family sooner, before any wedding plans had even begun. Alaric admitted, honestly, that his own family had debated for years whether to honor the old agreement at all, given how much time had passed, and how different both families' lives had become since the promise was first made. It was only when word reached them that Claire, the daughter originally expected to fulfill the promise, had broken her own engagement to marry someone outside the family entirely, that the matter became urgent again, since it meant the responsibility would now, by tradition, fall to Elena instead. Elena felt a flicker of something complicated at this explanation, not quite anger, but something closer to sorrow. She asked whether he had known, before arriving at the church, that her wedding to Daniel was already happening. Alaric admitted he had learned of it only that morning, and had made the decision quickly, believing it necessary to intervene before misunderstanding or manipulation from other parties could complicate matters further. He apologized again for the timing, acknowledging that arriving in the middle of her wedding, regardless of intention, had likely caused her additional pain on a day already filled with heartbreak. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his honesty against the strangeness of everything he described. She asked, finally, what exactly he expected from her now, whether he intended to insist she honor a promise made before she was even born, regardless of her own wishes. Alaric's answer came slowly, carefully chosen. He said he had no interest in forcing anyone into a marriage built on obligation alone. He told her that if she wished to walk away entirely, he would respect that choice without resentment, though he could not promise the consequences to her family's old alliances would remain untouched. But he added, quietly, that he hoped she might consider learning more, spending time understanding the world he came from, before deciding anything permanent. Elena sat with his words for a long while, watching the steam rise from her untouched tea, aware of Grace waiting patiently at a table near the door, aware of the strange, unfamiliar calm settling over her, despite everything unresolved between them. she did not give him an answer that day. But for the first time since the wedding, she left the conversation feeling less like a woman drowning in someone else's decisions, and more like someone standing, however uncertainly, at the very beginning of choosing her own. Over the following 2 weeks, Elena found herself drawn into a world she had never known existed, despite growing up only a few hours' drive from its borders. Alaric invited her, gently and without pressure, to visit the private estate his family maintained outside the city, a sprawling property surrounded by tall iron gates and quiet forested land that seemed to swallow the noise of the outside world entirely. She brought Grace along for the first visit, both of them unsure what to expect, as their car wound along a long gravel driveway, lined with old oak trees. What greeted them was not the fantastical palace Elena had half imagined from Alaric's careful descriptions, but something quieter, more dignified, a large stone house, filled with warm light and the low hum of everyday life. Staff moved about with practiced efficiency, greeting Alaric with genuine warmth rather than stiff formality, and Elena found herself surprised by how ordinary, in some ways, this hidden world actually felt. Alaric introduced her to a few members of his household that first day, including an older woman named Charlotte, who served as his closest advisor and had known him since he was a boy. Charlotte greeted Elena with careful politeness at first, though her sharp eyes clearly assessed every detail, from the nervous way Elena held her teacup to the careful distance she kept from Alaric throughout their conversation. Over several visits, Elena began learning the history behind the private community Alaric led, a group that had existed quietly for generations, valuing loyalty, tradition, and self-sufficiency over public recognition. She learned that the promise her grandfather made had not been an isolated arrangement, but one small piece of a much larger web of alliances that had protected this community, and by extension her own family's business interests, for decades without her ever realizing it. Slowly, cautiously, something between them began to shift. Alaric never pushed her, never mentioned marriage unless she raised the subject first, and instead spent their time together simply talking, walking the estate's quiet gardens, answering her endless questions with patience that never seemed to wear thin no matter how many times she circled back to the same worries. Elena found herself, almost against her will, comparing him constantly to Daniel, where Daniel had often grown impatient with her questions, brushing off her concerns with a charming smile, meant to end the conversation rather than continue it. Alaric seemed to welcome every question as an opportunity to understand her better. Where Daniel had rarely noticed the small details of her days, Alaric remembered things she mentioned only once, asking about them again weeks later with genuine interest. Still, she remained cautious. Heartbreak had taught her, painfully, how easily charm could hide betrayal, and she was not eager to repeat the same mistake twice, even with a man whose intentions seemed, so far, remarkably sincere. Meanwhile, back in the city, the fallout from the wedding continued to ripple outward. Daniel and Claire, now living together openly, found themselves facing a very different reception than the one they had likely imagined when choosing love over loyalty. Daniel's family, embarrassed by the public scandal and the damage it caused to long-standing business relationships, distanced themselves quickly, cutting his access to several key accounts he had once managed with ease. Claire, meanwhile, discovered that many of her old friends, once so quick to gossip about Elena's misfortune, now regarded her with a wariness she had not anticipated, unwilling to align themselves too closely with someone who had so publicly betrayed her own sister. Margaret called Elena often during these weeks, her voice growing steadily more anxious with each conversation. She admitted, eventually, that Claire had come to her in tears, insisting that Daniel had changed since the wedding, growing distant and irritable now that the initial thrill of scandal had faded into the harder reality of consequence. Elena listened to these updates with a strange, hollow detachment, surprised to find that news of Daniel and Claire's struggles brought her less satisfaction than she once might have expected. She was too focused now on her own uncertain path forward to spend much energy dwelling on theirs. It was during her fourth visit to the estate that Elena finally asked Alaric the question that had been quietly building inside her for days. She asked him, directly, why he had never married before now, given his age and his position within his community. Surely, she reasoned, there had been other women in his life, other opportunities to settle the old promise years earlier, through a different path entirely. Alaric considered the question seriously before answering, his gaze drifting briefly toward the gardens outside the window before returning to her. He admitted that he had, in fact, known about the old promise his entire adult life, understanding that one day it might call him toward a marriage he had never personally chosen. Rather than resent the arrangement, he said, he had simply waited, focusing his energy on leading his community responsibly, trusting that when the moment finally arrived, he would meet whoever fate placed in front of him with honesty rather than resentment. Elena asked, quietly, whether he resented it now, meeting her under such strange and painful circumstances rather than through any choice of his own. Alaric's answer came without hesitation. He said that whatever the circumstances of their meeting, he did not regret it, and that spending these past weeks getting to know her had already given him more genuine connection than years of arranged introductions with women chosen solely for political convenience ever had. He admitted, with unusual openness, that he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he had expected to, and that her honesty, even when sharp with grief or suspicion, was something he valued deeply. Elena did not know how to respond to such directness, unused to receiving it after months of Daniel's careful, calculated charm. She changed the subject instead, though she found herself thinking about his words long after she returned home that evening, turning them over carefully, searching for hidden motives she was increasingly unable to find. Grace noticed the shift in her friend almost immediately, teasing her gently one evening as they sat together in Elena's apartment, surrounded by the quiet clutter of ordinary life that felt increasingly distant from the world Elena now split her time between. She asked, half joking, half serious, whether Elena was beginning to fall for the mysterious man who had once claimed her as his bride in front of 200 wedding guests. Elena denied it quickly, though the flush rising in her cheeks told a different story entirely. She admitted, more honestly after a moment, that she did not know what she felt yet, only that, whatever it was, it felt entirely different from anything she had experienced with Daniel. Slower, steadier, built on questions answered honestly, rather than promises made carelessly. Grace, ever perceptive, pointed out gently that perhaps that steadiness was exactly what made this different, and possibly exactly what Elena needed after everything Daniel had put her through. Elena did not have an answer for that either. Not yet. But as the weeks continued, and her visits to the estate grew more frequent, she found herself, slowly and carefully, beginning to imagine a future she had never once considered before that chaotic afternoon on the church steps. Not a future built on the ashes of betrayal, but one built, cautiously, on honesty, patience, and the strange, unexpected steadiness of a man who had arrived wearing a crown she had not yet fully understood, but was beginning, piece by piece, to respect. Winter settled over the estate slowly, turning the gardens Elena had come to love into quiet stretches of frost-covered grass and bare branches. She found herself visiting more often now, sometimes without any particular reason beyond wanting to spend time in the calm, unhurried rhythm of Alaric's world, so different from the anxious energy that still lingered in her old life back in the city. Charlotte, once carefully guarded around her, had softened considerably over the weeks, occasionally sharing small stories from Alaric's childhood that made Elena laugh despite herself. She learned that Alaric had been a serious child, quick to take responsibility long before anyone expected it of him, especially after his father passed away when he was still quite young, leaving him to grow into leadership far earlier than most in his position. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, sitting together in the estate's library while snow gathered softly outside the tall windows, that Alaric finally asked Elena the question she had, in some ways, been waiting for since their very first conversation. He asked her, gently, whether she had given any more thought to the old promise, and whether she felt any closer to deciding what she wanted her future to look like. Elena set down the book she had been only half reading, and considered her answer carefully. She admitted that these past weeks had changed something in her, slowly, and without her fully realizing it at first. She no longer felt the same reluctance she had carried onto the church steps weeks earlier, the fear of being forced into obligation without choice. Instead, she found herself genuinely curious about the life he was offering, drawn not by duty, but by the quiet, steady connection that had grown between them, almost without her noticing. Still, she admitted honestly, she was frightened. Her last engagement had ended in public humiliation, and some small part of her worried that trusting so completely again, especially so soon, might simply be setting herself up for a different kind of heartbreak. Alaric listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he did not rush to reassure her the way Daniel once might have. Smoothing over her fears with easy words meant only to end the conversation quickly. Instead, he acknowledged her fear directly, telling her that trust, once broken, deserved to be rebuilt carefully, rather than demanded all at once. He told her he was willing to wait as long as she needed, that he had no interest in rushing her into a decision simply because tradition suggested it should already be settled. It was this patience, more than anything else he had said or done since their first meeting, that finally began dissolving the last of Elena's guarded resistance. She realized, sitting there in the quiet library with snow falling gently outside, that Daniel had never once offered her this kind of space, always eager instead to move quickly toward whatever outcome benefited him most. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened in small, meaningful ways. Alaric began including her in some of the responsibilities he carried within his community, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely valued her perspective. He asked her opinion on matters involving the estate's local charitable projects, listened carefully to her suggestions regarding a community education program he had been developing, and seemed genuinely pleased whenever her ideas improved upon his own. Elena, in turn, found herself opening up more than she had in years, sharing not just her grief over Daniel's betrayal, but older, quieter insecurities she had rarely spoken about with anyone, including Grace. She told him about growing up slightly overlooked in comparison to Claire's louder, more attention-seeking personality, about the quiet ache of always feeling one step behind her sister, despite never quite understanding why. Alaric listened to these confessions with the same careful attention he gave to matters of far greater consequence, never dismissing her feelings as trivial, never rushing to comfort her simply to move the conversation elsewhere. One afternoon, as they walked together through the frozen gardens, bundled against the cold, Elena finally asked him something that had been quietly troubling her. She asked whether he ever worried that she had only grown close to him because of the circumstances that brought them together, rather than because of who he truly was as a person. Alaric considered the question seriously, as he always did, before answering. He admitted the thought had crossed his mind more than once during their early visits, when her guardedness had been sharpest. But he told her that somewhere along the way, watching her slowly relax into honest conversation, watching her challenge his opinions, rather than simply agreeing to please him, he had stopped worrying entirely. He said he no longer saw her as a bride bound by old obligation, but as a woman he had genuinely come to care for, regardless of what history had originally intended for either of them. Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tightness she had carried since the wedding finally beginning to ease. She admitted, quietly, that she felt something similar, that somewhere in these past weeks, without any grand realization or dramatic turning point, she had simply begun to trust him. They stopped walking then, standing together beneath one of the tall, frost-covered trees lining the garden path. Alaric reached for her hand, his grip gentle rather than demanding, and asked whether she would consider, when she felt ready, allowing their arrangement to grow into something real, chosen freely, rather than inherited from old family history. Elena did not answer immediately, though she did not pull her hand away either. She told him, honestly, that she needed a little more time, not because she doubted her feelings, but because she wanted to be certain she was choosing this future for herself, rather than simply drifting into it out of relief after Daniel's betrayal. Alaric nodded, entirely unbothered by her request for patience, and told her that whenever she was ready, whether that took another week or another year, he would still be here waiting, without resentment or pressure. It was, Elena realized as they continued their walk back toward the house, an entirely different kind of promise than the one her grandfather had made decades earlier. Not one built on old debts or family alliances, but one built quietly, deliberately, between two people slowly choosing to trust each other, despite everything that had gone wrong before. That evening, before returning home, Elena found herself standing once more in the estate's grand entryway, watching Alaric say goodbye to a few staff members with the same warmth and respect he showed everyone, regardless of their position within the household. She thought, watching him, of how different this quiet, steady kindness felt, compared to the careless charm Daniel had once used so easily to win her affection. For the first time since her wedding day had collapsed into chaos, Elena felt something unexpected settle over her. Not certainty, not yet, but hope. Real, cautious hope, built not on the desperate need to escape her heartbreak, but on the growing belief that perhaps, despite everything, she had stumbled into something far better than what she had lost. News of Elena's growing connection to Alaric eventually made its way back to Claire, carried through the careless chatter of mutual acquaintances who had begun noticing Elena's absence from her usual circles. At first, Claire dismissed the rumors, certain her sister would never recover quickly enough from heartbreak to entertain another relationship, let alone one involving a man of Alaric's apparent standing. But as the weeks passed and the rumors persisted, growing more detailed with each retelling, something uncomfortable began stirring in Claire's chest. She had expected, in some quiet corner of her mind, that Elena would remain a cautionary tale for months, perhaps years, a bruised reminder of the wedding day scandal that had briefly overshadowed even Claire's own choices. Instead, whispers now suggested that Elena was being courted by someone wealthier, more powerful, and far more composed than Daniel had ever been. Daniel, for his part, had grown increasingly difficult to live with since the wedding. The easy charm that once made him so appealing had curdled into irritability once the consequences of his choices became impossible to ignore. His family's business connections had grown noticeably colder, several important contracts quietly redirected to competitors whose reputations had not been damaged by public scandal. He blamed Claire often now, though never directly, letting his frustration leak out in small, cutting remarks about her spending habits or her tendency to bring up Elena's name whenever she felt insecure. It was during one such argument that Claire finally admitted, out loud, the jealousy that had been quietly building inside her for weeks. She told Daniel, sharply, that it was deeply unfair that Elena, the sister who had been publicly humiliated, now appeared to be building a far more impressive future than the one Claire had gambled everything to secure for herself. Daniel, seeking any distraction from his own mounting frustrations, seized upon Claire's jealousy eagerly, suggesting that perhaps this new relationship of Elena's was not as genuine as it appeared. Surely, he reasoned, a man of Alaric's apparent wealth and standing had other motives beyond simple affection for a woman he had only just met under such dramatic circumstances. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, watching Claire's expression shift from hurt to calculation, there was an opportunity here worth exploring. Over the following days, Claire found herself dwelling more and more on this idea, turning it over until it began to feel less like idle speculation and more like a plan worth pursuing. If she could uncover some flaw in Alaric's intentions, some hidden motive that would tarnish Elena's newfound happiness, perhaps it would finally quiet the uncomfortable envy gnawing at her since the rumors first began circulating. She began reaching out cautiously to old acquaintances who might know something about Alaric's world, careful never to reveal her true intentions, framing her questions instead as simple curiosity about her sister's new relationship. Most people knew very little, since Alaric's community had always guarded its privacy carefully. But Claire eventually found one distant contact, a woman named Sophie, who had once worked briefly for a business connected to Alaric's estate, before leaving under circumstances she described only vaguely as difficult. Sophie, when Claire finally arranged to meet her, proved eager to share complaints about her former employer's practices, though it quickly became clear her grievances had more to do with her own dismissal than with any genuine wrongdoing on Alaric's part. Still, Claire listened carefully, extracting small details she believed might be twisted into something more damaging with the right framing. Armed with these fragments, exaggerated and reshaped to suit her purposes, Claire began quietly planting seeds of doubt among Elena's old friends and distant family members, suggesting that Alaric's community operated under stricter, more controlling rules than anyone realized, and that Elena might be walking unknowingly into a relationship far more restrictive than the freedom she believed she was gaining. Word of these whispers eventually reached Grace, who brought them directly to Elena rather than allowing rumor to spread unchecked. Elena listened carefully, her stomach tightening with a familiar unease, though she forced herself to consider the claims rationally, rather than reacting purely from fear. She brought the rumors directly to Alaric during her next visit, watching his reaction carefully as she repeated what she had heard. To her relief, rather than growing defensive or dismissive, Alaric listened seriously, asking detailed questions about where the rumors had originated. When Elena mentioned Sophie's name, something shifted in his expression, recognition mixed with quiet frustration. He explained, calmly, that Sophie had indeed once worked for a small business, connected loosely to his estate, but had been let go, after repeated incidents of dishonesty involving missing funds, a situation handled quietly and professionally at the time to avoid unnecessary scandal. He admitted, honestly, that perhaps that discretion had been a mistake, since it left Sophie free to spread whatever version of events served her bitterness now. Elena believed him immediately, not simply because his explanation made sense, but because of how directly he addressed her concerns, rather than deflecting them, the way Daniel so often had, whenever uncomfortable questions arose. Still, she found herself wondering who exactly had directed Sophie towards spreading these particular rumors now, months after her dismissal, and specifically timed to coincide with Elena's growing closeness to Alaric. It did not take much investigation for Grace, ever protective and increasingly suspicious, to trace the rumors back toward Claire's small circle of acquaintances. When she shared this discovery with Elena, something painful settled over her, confirmation of a betrayal she had half suspected but hoped, foolishly perhaps, was not true. Elena confronted Claire directly, the first real conversation between the sisters since the wedding day chaos. Claire, cornered, initially denied any involvement, insisting Elena was simply looking for someone to blame for her own insecurities about the relationship. But Elena, calmer and more composed than she had been in weeks, pressed further, listing details about Sophie's dismissal that only someone actively investigating Alaric's business would have uncovered. Eventually, Claire's composure cracked. She admitted, through tears that felt more like frustration than genuine remorse, that she had been struggling to watch Elena's life apparently flourish, while her own relationship with Daniel grew increasingly strained. She insisted she had never meant real harm, only wanted reassurance that Elena's happiness was not somehow more deserved than her own. Elena listened to this explanation with a complicated mixture of sadness and clarity. She realized, standing there in her sister's cramped apartment, that Claire's jealousy had likely existed long before the wedding day itself, quietly shaping decisions neither of them had ever openly discussed. She told Claire, honestly, that she did not hate her, but that she needed distance now, real distance, to build whatever future she was choosing, without the constant undertow of her sister's resentment pulling at it. Claire did not argue. Perhaps, deep down, she recognized the fairness in Elena's request, even if pride kept her from admitting it fully. Elena left the conversation feeling lighter than she had expected, as though setting a firm boundary with her sister had finally released a weight she had been carrying since childhood, without ever fully naming it. When she told Alaric about the confrontation later that evening, he listened quietly, offering no judgment about Claire, only quiet reassurance that Elena had handled the situation with more grace than most people would have managed under similar circumstances. Elena knew, however, watching the careful way Alaric absorbed this new information, that Claire's jealousy, left unresolved, was unlikely to disappear entirely. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small, cautious voice warned her that this quiet confrontation might only be the beginning of a much larger storm, still building on the horizon. The confrontation with Claire did little to ease the tension building beneath the surface of Elena's new life, and within a few weeks, the quiet rumors Claire had once spread through careful whispers escalated into something far more public and far more dangerous. It began with an article published on a small but widely read gossip website, one that had clearly been fed information from someone close to the situation. The piece painted Alaric's community in a deliberately sinister light, suggesting hidden financial improprieties, questionable business practices, and a pattern of controlling behavior toward the women who had once been associated with the family. Though most of the claims were vague, carefully worded to avoid direct legal accusation, the implication was clear enough to spark immediate curiosity and concern among readers. Elena discovered the article the same way most of the city seemed to, through a flurry of concerned messages from distant acquaintances and a series of increasingly worried calls from her mother. Margaret, already anxious about the entire situation since the day Alaric appeared at the church, urged Elena to reconsider the relationship entirely, frightened that whatever reputation Alaric's family carried might eventually reflect poorly on the Marsh name as well. Elena, though shaken by the article's harsh tone, refused to let panic dictate her response immediately. She brought the article directly to Alaric, watching closely as he read through it in tense silence, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. When he finally looked up, his expression carried more exhaustion than anger, the weary look of a man who had encountered this particular tactic before. He explained to Elena that his family's privacy, carefully maintained for generations, had always made them an easy target for exaggerated rumor, since so few people outside the community understood their actual practices well enough to correct false narratives when they appeared. He admitted, honestly, that some of the details mentioned in the article bore an unsettling resemblance to information only a handful of people close to the estate would have access to, information that closely echoed the same distorted claims Sophie had spread weeks earlier. Someone, it seemed, had taken those earlier whispers and shaped them into something far more damaging, timed deliberately to reach a much wider audience. Elena felt a familiar unease settle in her stomach, suspecting immediately who might be behind such an escalation. When she raised Claire's name cautiously, Alaric did not dismiss the possibility, though he cautioned her against jumping to conclusions without clearer evidence. That evening, Charlotte arrived at the estate with grim news of her own. Through careful inquiry among contacts still loyal to the family, she had traced the article's true source, not to any major news organization, but to a small freelance writer who had recently been paid a substantial sum for the piece by someone using a private, difficult-to-trace account. Further digging revealed a faint connection between that account and a business contact belonging to Daniel's family, someone eager to please him after his own reputation had suffered such public damage. The pieces fell into place slowly but unmistakably. Daniel, frustrated by his own diminishing standing and encouraged by Claire's simmering resentment, had apparently decided that damaging Elena's new relationship might somehow restore some sense of balance to his own crumbling situation, perhaps believing that if Elena's happiness collapsed publicly, his own humiliation might finally fade from public memory. Elena felt a fresh wave of anger at this discovery, sharper than anything she had experienced since the wedding itself. It was one thing for Claire's jealousy to manifest through quiet, misguided whispers among old friends. It was another entirely for Daniel to actively involve himself in spreading damaging falsehoods about a man and a community that had, so far, done nothing but treat her with honesty and care. Alaric, watching Elena process this news, remained remarkably composed, though Elena could sense the controlled tension beneath his calm exterior. He told her that he did not intend to let the article stand unanswered, not out of concern for his own reputation, which he had long grown accustomed to defending quietly, but because he refused to let false claims damage Elena's standing or peace of mind any further. Over the following days, Alaric moved carefully but decisively. Rather than issuing a defensive public statement, which he believed would only draw further attention to unproven claims, he arranged instead for a respected, independent journalist, known for thorough and balanced reporting, to conduct a genuine investigation into his family's community and its business practices. He opened his estate's records willingly, allowed interviews with long-standing staff members and community residents, and answered every question the journalist raised without hesitation or evasion. The resulting article, published just over a week later in a far more reputable publication, painted an entirely different picture than the one Daniel had paid to manufacture. It detailed a private, tightly knit community, focused on charitable work, sustainable local business, and quiet, generational loyalty, rather than any hidden scandal. The journalist noted, pointedly, the vague and unverifiable nature of the original article's claims, along with the suspicious timing of its publication. Public opinion shifted quickly once the more thorough reporting emerged, and the original gossip piece was swiftly discredited, with several outlets openly questioning its journalistic integrity. Whispers soon began circulating instead about who might have paid for such a deliberately misleading piece in the first place, and it did not take long before Daniel's name surfaced in those same rumor circles he and Claire had once used so effectively against Elena. The backlash against Daniel proved swift and unforgiving. His family, already embarrassed by months of scandal, distanced themselves from him almost entirely once his involvement in the smear campaign became widely suspected, cutting whatever financial support and business connections still remained. Claire, watching her own reputation crumble alongside his, found herself increasingly isolated, her earlier jealousy now transformed into something closer to genuine desperation. Elena, meanwhile, found herself unexpectedly grateful for Alaric's careful, measured response to the entire ordeal. Rather than reacting with anger or public retaliation, he had chosen honesty and patience, allowing the truth to dismantle the lies on its own terms, rather than escalating the conflict further. It was a stark contrast to Daniel's impulsive, self-serving behavior, and it left Elena more certain than ever that she had found something genuinely different in the man who had once arrived so unexpectedly at her ruined wedding. Still, as the dust settled and public attention began drifting toward newer scandals, Elena could not shake the uneasy feeling that Claire and Daniel, humiliated and increasingly desperate, were unlikely to accept defeat so easily. Whatever peace she had found over these past weeks felt, for the first time, dangerously fragile, as though the real confrontation still waited somewhere just ahead, gathering strength before its final arrival. Spring arrived slowly, softening the frozen edges of the estate's gardens into something greener and warmer, and with it came a shift in Elena's own heart that she could no longer deny or explain away as simple curiosity. The fear that had once gripped her so tightly after Daniel's betrayal had, over these past months, loosened its hold, replaced gradually by something steadier and far more certain. She spent most of her free time at the estate now, often staying through entire weekends, growing familiar with the rhythms of a life she once thought impossibly foreign. Charlotte had grown genuinely fond of her, teasing her gently during shared afternoons in the kitchen, showing her small traditions the household had followed for generations. The staff greeted her warmly whenever she arrived, no longer treating her as a temporary guest, but as someone who clearly belonged among them. It was during one of these quiet weekends, as the two of them walked together through the newly blooming garden paths, that Elena finally allowed herself to say aloud what she had been feeling for weeks. She told Alaric, her voice steady despite the vulnerability behind her words, that she no longer needed more time to decide. She told him that somewhere between their long conversations in the library, the careful patience he had shown through every difficult revelation, and the quiet steadiness of his presence through every storm Daniel and Claire had thrown at them, she had fallen in love with him. Alaric stopped walking entirely, turning to face her fully, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him before. The careful composure he carried through most of his public life, momentarily set aside entirely. He told her, quietly, that he had cared for her far longer than he had ever admitted, from the very first conversation in that small city cafe weeks earlier, when her honesty and quiet strength had struck him far more deeply than he expected from someone he had approached initially, out of obligation rather than choice. He admitted, with unusual openness, that he had worried for weeks about saying so too soon, afraid of pressuring her into feelings she was not yet ready to claim for herself, especially given how recently her heart had been broken by someone she trusted completely. But hearing her speak so plainly now, he said, he no longer saw any reason to hold back his own feelings any longer. They stood together beneath the newly blooming trees for a long while, saying little more, simply allowing the quiet certainty between them to settle into something solid and real. When Elena finally spoke again, her voice carried a lightness she had not felt since long before her wedding day collapsed into chaos. She asked him, half teasing, half serious, whether this meant he still intended to make good on his original claim from the church steps, the one about coming to collect his bride. Alaric laughed, a rare, genuine sound that Elena had come to treasure over these months, precisely because of how infrequently he allowed himself such open joy. He told her that he intended to ask her properly, in his own time, when the moment felt right rather than rushed, though he admitted the old promise from her grandfather no longer factored into his reasoning at all. Whatever happened next between them, he wanted it built entirely on their own choice, free from any lingering obligation neither of them had ever asked for. News of their deepening relationship soon reached beyond the estate's private grounds, spreading through more respectable channels this time, carried by mutual friends and community members who had grown genuinely fond of watching Elena settle so naturally into their world. Margaret, initially cautious throughout the entire ordeal, finally softened as well, visiting the estate for the first time, and watching with quiet relief as her daughter laughed freely among people who clearly adored her. Henry, though still carrying some guilt over the secrecy he and Margaret had maintained for years, found himself gradually reassured as well, recognizing in Alaric's steady, respectful treatment of Elena something entirely different from the reckless carelessness Daniel had once shown. Over a quiet dinner at the estate, the two men spoke privately for the first time, and whatever tension remained between them regarding the old family promise seemed to dissolve into something closer to mutual respect. Not everyone, however, greeted this new chapter with such warmth. Claire, watching from the sidelines as her sister's life continued to flourish, despite every attempt to derail it, found her earlier desperation curdling into something far more reckless. Daniel, increasingly bitter after losing what remained of his family's support, encouraged her worst instincts rather than tempering them, insisting that surely there remained some way to reclaim what public opinion and personal fortune had already stripped from them both. Together, isolated now from most of their previous social circles, and increasingly desperate for any path back toward relevance, the two of them began quietly plotting one final scheme, one they believed might not only damage Elena's happiness irreparably, but perhaps even secure some financial advantage for themselves in the process, should things unfold exactly as they intended. Elena, blissfully unaware of the storm quietly gathering on the horizon, spent these weeks instead wrapped in the warm, steady joy of a love she had never expected to find, especially not through such an unlikely beginning. She could not have known, walking hand in hand with Alaric through the blooming gardens, that Claire and Daniel's final desperate gamble was already taking shape, waiting only for the right moment to strike at the very foundation of everything she had so carefully, so hopefully built. The plan Claire and Daniel eventually settled on relied on a document neither of them had any legal right to create, but desperation, they told themselves, justified the risk. Working with a contact Daniel still maintained from his family's old business dealings, a man skilled enough with forged paperwork to make convincing copies of official records, they constructed a fraudulent document claiming that Elena's grandfather had, in fact, voided the old family promise, decades earlier, through a private settlement paid quietly to Alaric's family, meaning the entire arrangement bringing Elena and Alaric together had been built upon a debt that no longer legally existed. Their intention was simple, if reckless. If they could present this forged document publicly, timed to coincide with any formal announcement of Elena and Alaric's engagement, they believed it would cast doubt over the legitimacy of the entire relationship, embarrassing Alaric's family publicly, and possibly forcing a financial settlement from his estate to quietly resolve the resulting confusion. Payment they intended to ensure found its way, eventually, into their own struggling finances. They chose their moment carefully, arriving unannounced at a small gathering the estate was hosting to celebrate the community's spring charitable initiative, an event attended by several respected members of the wider business community, along with a handful of journalists who had, since the earlier scandal, taken a genuine interest in fair, accurate coverage of Alaric's family. Claire arrived first, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling remorse. Approaching Elena directly in front of several onlookers, she apologized, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, for the pain she had caused over the past months, insisting she only wanted to make things right between them before matters progressed any further. Elena, caught off guard by the public display, hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this sudden shift or brace herself for whatever manipulation might follow. It was Daniel's arrival moments later, document in hand, that revealed the true purpose behind their visit. He addressed the gathered crowd directly, his voice carrying the practiced charm Elena remembered so well from their own relationship, announcing that he had recently discovered troubling evidence suggesting the entire foundation of Elena and Alaric's arrangement was built upon a debt already settled years earlier, meaning neither family owed the other anything further, least of all a marriage neither Elena nor Alaric had ever truly been obligated to pursue. Gasps rippled through the small crowd as Daniel produced the forged document, holding it up as though its mere existence proved his claims beyond question. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances, while a few of the attending journalists began scribbling notes eagerly, sensing another dramatic turn in a story that had already captured public attention for months. Alaric, however, remained entirely composed, stepping forward calmly to examine the document Daniel held out toward him with such obvious confidence. He studied it carefully for a long moment, his expression giving nothing away, before finally speaking, his voice steady enough to carry clearly across the quiet garden. He noted first that the official seal printed on the document belonged to an office that had, according to his own family's carefully maintained records, changed its formal seal design nearly 15 years after the date claimed on this particular paper, a small but unmistakable detail that immediately called the document's authenticity into serious question. Charlotte, who had joined the gathering upon hearing the commotion, confirmed this detail immediately, having personally overseen much of the estate's official correspondence with that very office for decades. She added further that she recognized the signature style used on the document as belonging to a clerk who had not even begun working in that position until several years after the supposed settlement date. Daniel's confident expression faltered slightly as murmurs of skepticism began rippling through the crowd, several guests now exchanging doubtful glances rather than the shocked concern he had clearly hoped to provoke. Claire, sensing the plan unraveling faster than either of them anticipated, attempted to intervene, insisting the details were minor and irrelevant compared to the larger truth the document supposedly revealed. But Alaric was not finished. He revealed, calmly, that his estate had, in fact, anticipated exactly this kind of attempt weeks earlier, following the earlier smear campaign traced back to Daniel's involvement. Charlotte had quietly arranged for a full, independently verified copy of the original settlement records to be reviewed by a neutral, respected legal authority, precisely to prevent any future confusion or manipulation regarding the old family promise. That verified documentation, Alaric explained, clearly showed no such settlement had ever taken place, and he offered, calmly, to have those authentic records made available immediately to anyone present who wished to compare them directly against the paper Daniel currently held. The crowd's mood shifted decisively at this offer, several guests now openly questioning Daniel and Claire's motives, rather than the legitimacy of Elena and Alaric's relationship. One of the attending journalists, recognizing the makings of a significant story, asked directly whether Daniel intended to explain where exactly this supposed document had originated, and who precisely had prepared it on his behalf. Daniel, cornered now in front of witnesses whose skepticism had turned unmistakably against him, attempted several increasingly desperate explanations, none of which satisfied the growing scrutiny surrounding him. Claire, realizing the full weight of the humiliation now unfolding in front of a crowd far larger and more influential than the one that had witnessed her original betrayal at the wedding, finally broke down entirely, admitting through frustrated tears that the document had indeed been fabricated, though she insisted, weakly, that the idea had originated with Daniel rather than herself. Security quietly escorted the two of them from the estate grounds shortly afterward, their humiliation now complete and thoroughly witnessed by exactly the kind of influential audience whose good opinion they had once relied upon so heavily. Word of the failed scheme spread quickly, this time firmly cementing public opinion against them both, any remaining sympathy from earlier months evaporating entirely once their attempted forgery became widely known. Elena, standing beside Alaric as the last of the commotion settled, felt an unexpected calm settle over her despite everything that had just unfolded. She realized, watching Claire and Daniel's car disappear down the estate's long driveway for what she suspected would be the final time, that whatever hold their betrayal once held over her heart had finally, completely broken. Alaric took her hand gently, asking quietly whether she was all right after such a public and stressful confrontation. Elena nodded, surprising herself with the honesty of her answer. She told him she felt lighter than she had in months, as though this final, failed attempt at sabotage had somehow closed a door she had been unconsciously holding open since her wedding day collapsed into chaos. Charlotte, ever practical, suggested gently that perhaps this was, in fact, the perfect moment to finally announce what many of the gathered guests had already suspected for weeks. Alaric glanced at Elena, silently asking permission, and when she nodded, smiling despite everything that had just occurred, he turned back toward the small crowd still lingering nearby. He announced, simply and without any further formality, that Elena had agreed, freely and without any obligation from old family promises, to become his wife. The crowd's earlier tension dissolved instantly into genuine warmth, applause rippling through the garden as guests offered their congratulations, delighted to witness something joyful emerge, so cleanly from the chaos that had briefly threatened to overshadow it. Elena, standing there, surrounded by genuine well-wishes rather than pitying whispers, finally allowed herself to fully believe what these past months had been quietly building toward all along. Whatever pain Daniel and Claire's betrayal had once caused her, it had, however unintentionally, led her directly toward a life far steadier, far more honest, and far more genuinely hers than anything she had once imagined standing at that first ruined altar. The wedding took place in early summer, in the same quiet gardens where Elena and Alaric had spent so many of their early conversations, the same paths where trust had slowly replaced fear, and where love had eventually grown from something neither of them had originally chosen into something both of them had finally embraced completely. Unlike her first wedding, this one carried none of the frantic, anxious energy Elena remembered from months earlier. There was no rush to please distant relatives, no pressure to impress business partners through elaborate displays of wealth. Instead, the day unfolded with the same quiet, deliberate warmth that had defined Elena's entire courtship with Alaric. Every detail chosen not for appearances, but for genuine meaning. Grace stood beside her throughout the morning preparations, just as she had months earlier, though this time her presence carried none of the anxious tension from that first, disastrous day. She helped Elena into a simple, elegant gown, far less extravagant than the one she had worn before, though somehow far more beautiful for its quiet restraint. Grace, fastening the final clasp at the back of the dress, told Elena softly that she had never seen her look so genuinely happy, not even during the early excitement of her engagement to Daniel. Margaret arrived to help as well, her earlier guilt over the family's long-kept secret finally replaced by open, tearful pride. She adjusted Elena's veil with careful hands, telling her daughter quietly that whatever mistakes she and Henry had made in keeping the old promise hidden for so long, she had never once doubted that Elena deserved every bit of happiness now unfolding in front of her. Henry, waiting to walk Elena down the aisle, embraced her warmly before they stepped outside, admitting with unusual openness that he had grown to respect Alaric deeply over these past months, not for his position or wealth, but for the steady, honest way he had treated Elena through every difficult challenge thrown at their relationship. The garden itself had been transformed simply but beautifully, rows of soft white chairs arranged beneath the same trees, where Elena and Alaric had first admitted their feelings for one another months earlier. Guests included many of the household staff who had grown fond of Elena over her many visits, alongside a small, carefully chosen group of family and close friends, far more intimate than the crowded, chaotic wedding that had once ended so painfully. As Elena walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she caught sight of Alaric, waiting for her beneath an arch of blooming flowers, his expression carrying none of the composed formality she remembered from their earliest meetings. Instead, his face held something far softer, an open, unguarded joy that mirrored exactly what she felt swelling in her own chest. The ceremony itself was simple, filled with quiet vows, exchanged not out of obligation to old family promises, but from genuine choice, carefully considered and freely given. When Alaric spoke his vows, his voice steady, despite the emotion clearly present beneath it, he told Elena that whatever circumstances had first brought them together, nothing about his commitment to her now depended on old debts or family history. He loved her, simply and completely, for exactly who she was, independent of anything either family had once decided on her behalf. Elena, in turn, spoke of the unexpected gift hidden within her original heartbreak, admitting that had Daniel never betrayed her so publicly, she might never have discovered the steady, honest love that had grown so naturally between herself and Alaric. She told him that she no longer viewed her wedding day collapse as the worst moment of her life, but rather as the painful, necessary beginning of a much better story than the one she had originally imagined for herself. When the ceremony concluded and the small crowd rose in warm applause, Elena felt none of the lingering unease that had haunted the edges of her first attempt at marriage. There was no shadow of betrayal waiting in the wings, no whispered scandal threatening to unravel the celebration. Claire and Daniel, having quietly left the city following their failed scheme, were notably, peacefully absent, and Elena found she did not miss their presence at all. The reception that followed carried the same relaxed warmth as the ceremony itself, filled with genuine laughter, rather than careful performative celebration. Charlotte offered a toast that left several guests wiping away tears, recalling the quiet, uncertain young woman who had first arrived at the estate months earlier, and marveling at how completely she had grown into her role within their community, not through obligation, but through her own genuine warmth and quiet strength. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began drifting away into the warm summer night, Elena found herself standing once more beneath the same trees where Alaric had first asked her, so many months earlier, whether she might consider building a real future alongside him. She thought back to that frightened, heartbroken woman standing on the church steps, uncertain whether to trust the strange, composed stranger who had arrived so unexpectedly, wearing his quiet authority like a second skin. She realized, standing there now as his wife, surrounded by a community that had welcomed her so completely, that the crown Alaric wore had never truly been about titles or old family promises at all. It had always been about the steady, patient way he carried responsibility, the quiet strength with which he protected those he loved, and the genuine respect he showed to everyone around him, qualities Elena had come to admire, and love far more deeply than any inherited position ever could have earned on its own. Alaric found her there among the trees, slipping his arm gently around her waist, as they watched the last of the evening light fade into a warm, quiet dusk. He asked her, softly, whether she had any regrets about the strange, painful path that had eventually led them here together. Elena leaned into him, feeling entirely, peacefully certain, for the first time since her world had once shattered so publicly on those church steps. She told him, simply, that she would not change a single moment of it, not the heartbreak, not the confusion, not even the frightening uncertainty of those early weeks, because every difficult step had carried her, eventually, exactly where she was always meant to be. Together, they stood quietly beneath the trees, as the stars slowly emerged overhead. Two people who had found, against every unlikely odd, a genuine and lasting love, built not on old promises or inherited obligation, but on patience, honesty, and the quiet, steady choice to trust each other completely, one honest conversation at a time.